Good morning, everyone. I can't sleep. I woke up at 1:30, lay back down, and I can't sleep. It is now 2:58 a.m. California time. And I gave up. I just gave up. So I'm going to make myself a cup of coffee. And maybe this is an opportunity to do a book review. We'll see. All right. Now we're going to sit. And maybe I'll be able to put together an impromptu book review on a book I recently finished. You're getting a reflection in the window. I'm going to turn on another light. That's almost high enough. All right, let me turn on another light. So, I love the quiet of the morning. I just hate getting up that early. And you get to see that I have my pineapple dew. This is preparation for sleeping on a pillow so my curly hair doesn't go poof, So there we go. By the way, this is my favorite brand. Pete's Coffee. You find a lot of them over here in California. I'm sure they're up north of us as well, probably in Oregon, Washington State, although don't quote me on that. I could never find them on the East Coast, ever. There's a Dunkin' Donuts on every corner on the East Coast. More Starbucks than there used to be, which is a good brand as well. But I love Pete's. Okay, so as some of you may know, I did finally find an in-person book group, which was thrilling. And that first month that I met them with them was in February, and they had just finished reading Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. So I missed out on that one, but I did enjoy the conversation and the insight that I got from it. And for the next reading book, because this particular reading group gathers at my local Catholic parish, the one that I grew up in all those years, once a year or twice a year, depending on the liturgical seasons like Lent and Advent, they'll pick a book with that theme. All the other times of the year, it's just your average books that we're reading. So in my case, the first book I got to read was one that was for Lent. And Lent is a reflective time, and they wanted something with a more of a religious theme. Although I think this book could fall under some religious theme, but it also has a um, historical value to it. It's entitled A Song for Nagasaki. It's written by an Australian priest by the name of Paul Glynn. And he writes of a man by the name of Takashi Nagai, who was a physician who studied at the University of Nagasaki and ended up establishing his life in that city. And as we all know, at the end of World War II, we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this one man seemed to provide a very significant approach to healing from such a devastating occurrence for people. In that bombing, he lost his wife. And it was very difficult to read that scene where he goes back to his house. He had been wanting to go back from right after the bombing, but he was a physician and there were people who desperately needed help right away, and he wanted to attend to them to the best of his ability as well as the rest of his staff. When he was finally able to go home 2 days later, he went to where he knew his home was, but there was little to nothing left of it. And he found the remains of his wife. And how devastating that must have been for him. Some of the scenes in this book are difficult to read because it goes into some detail as to how that bomb affected their bodies, both immediately and in the long term. But there was also the emotional toll that this took on the people of Japan. There was anger, there was resentment, there was just incredible pain from the loss. Just a huge scale, a large scale loss in an instant. How are people supposed to process this? And Takashi Nagai, because of where he was on the inside, he was able to be an example to others who simply knew him and observed him and whatnot, of a way to process our grief that doesn't destroy us. And as someone who can understand the cost of grief on a smaller scale, but grief nonetheless, I was intrigued by this because it's true. Grief or trauma can make you or break you. It depends on what your decision is about that. And with Dr. Nagai, there was a contrast brought up towards the end of the book where they said if you go to the anniversary ceremonies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you see a contrast in how each city dealt with that grief. He said in Hiroshima, if you had to use an image, it would be a closed fist. There are people, young people, who protest on the day of that anniversary. And the tension, the feeling on that day is one of, there is no peace. But when you go to Nagasaki, it's completely the opposite. There are people there who are described as, it's an attitude of forgiveness, reconciliation, moving forward, and hope for the future. And Nagasaki credits this doctor Takashi Nagai, for much of that, because he was that voice of confidence and reason and of letting go of the bitterness, because what had happened had happened. There was no way to bring anyone back. They simply had to deal with the here and the now where they were and to decide how they were going to do that, what legacy they wanted to leave behind. This really is a beautiful book. In the beginning, Dr. Nagai, as a young man, especially in high school, was an era in Japan where science and reason ruled. And the teachers, he said, would not openly criticize the traditional Japanese beliefs like Shinto, but they would say things, for example, when they talked about a god who cut off the 8 heads of a serpent or a dragon, that perhaps the people got this story from some sort of river and its tributaries that were made in order to irrigate the land more efficiently. So this beast of a river was conquered, and its 8 tributaries did good for the people in the end, like that. So Dr. Nagai, by the time he had finished high school, had decided he believed in nothing. There was no God, there was only science and reason. But when he was in medical school a few years later, and he was very urgently called by his father to come home. His mother had suffered a stroke, and he remembers so clearly coming to the house, his father opening the door for him, bringing him to his mother's room, and he knelt by her bed. So you're thinking of Japan, the beds are on the floor, so he kneels by her bed. And he said her eyes followed him eagerly as he entered, and he came and he sat down beside her. And he held her hand. And he said, within minutes, she was gone. And she never took her eyes off him. And this had such a profound effect on him. For one, her love. She waited for him. Number 2, he could not deny that he sensed there was something more to her existence than just her physical life. And it began to sort of shake that cage, that world that he'd created for himself. So that was a turning point in his life. And it was over a series of several years. He began to question and to search. He recalled that in high school he read a book by Pascal Pensies, which we're familiar with, but which was new to him. He had not been exposed to a lot of Western philosophy. Although he was in traditional medical school, which I need to point out, because the Japanese so admired the Germans and their preciseness, their meticulousness, he was learning medicine from German textbooks in German, which blows my mind. So he had double duty. He had to learn German and learn medicine. Quite admirable. And in his journey, you see him starting, which was what was an intellectual approach to something that was more spiritual, but this is where he came from. He was a man who used his intellect. This was his world. And in time, he comes to a crossroads. He was aware of the history of Japan when the Jesuits first came to Japan, St. Ignatius Loyola, and how eventually they were, the priests were exiled from Japan. Christianity was outlawed. There were those that were tortured and killed, as an example. And it only had the opposite effect, so that the Christians that remained in Japan sort of went underground. In his journey, his spiritual journey, he wanted to find out who these, our escape artist here, he wants to go outside. He's not going outside. Takashi's next step, he realized, after he got as many answers as he could through reason, and what was a sort of a, what's the word, a conflict, was that Blaise Pascal said, you cannot come to a belief in God, if you will, by the use of reason. But Pascal used reason to prove that. So Takashi only got so far in his search before he realized he wanted to live with a local Catholic family and watch these people. What was this about? Really, he was coming from zero and he knew nothing. And he happened to find a room to stay at with a family that was, I don't know how many generations down the line. Takashi eventually finds a room to board at, which is about half a mile away from the University of Nagasaki, with a Catholic family whom he later learns is one of those secret Christian families that were in Japan since the 16th century. And so they had their rich history and their tradition. And he got to watch this family live. They're just their everyday faith, warts and all. So now you notice that Takashi's journey has gone from an intellectual pursuit to a spiritual one, something very foreign to him. He'd never done anything like this before. They have one daughter, and in time, through some trial and through this time period in Japan, they are eventually able to marry. He had to serve in the Japanese army. The militarists were the ones in control. And he had 2 children with his wife. I love how the author Paul Glynn wrote this story. I love how he taught us about how the Japanese language is written, because it's not a phonetic language like English is. It's a language based on symbols. And one word can be a combination of 2 or 3 symbols, for example. And in one example I want to give you that I highlighted here, my mother's eyes told me that the human spirit lives on after death. All this was by way of an intuition carrying conviction. Chokan, or intuition, is an important word in the Japanese vocabulary. It is made up of 2 ideographs, choku, meaning immediate or direct, and kan, meaning feelings, hence something that comes directly to the feelings. Far Easterners regard this knowledge very highly. Takai was attracted to Blaise Pascal because he made a statement that sounded very Japanese to Takashi. And it was, man is a thinking reed, R-E-E-D. Man is a thinking reed. And that's why he pursued reading Blaise Pascal, and he purchased a book, and this book became his companion wherever he went. He would read it on the train, during free time, in the evening when he was feeling thoughtful and pensive. In going on further with the ideographs, Since his last year at high school, the physical sciences offered Nagai what seemed the only reliable roads to truth. He was bewildered by this non-scientific intuition that his mother's spirit continued to live. Was this an authentic, undeniable experience of what Zen people called satori, or enlightenment, that comes like the flash of a sword cutting through the problems of existence? Or was his powerful intuition merely a trick of the unconscious, triggered by emotional wishful thinking? He wasn't sure, but the experience set him rethinking the long tradition of wisdom thinkers that were part of the history of Japan and China. Their insistence on the superiority of man's heart over his intellect was ensconced, he noted, in many age-old ideographs that he read daily. The ideograph for wisdom, for instance, was a composite of two ideographs. One was being intelligence, and the other containing heart. The ideograph for knowledge, however, was a composite of intelligence and weaving loom. Did that say that clever people can weave intellectual arguments with mere quick wit, while wise people are in touch with the deeper dimension of the heart? Again, there were two ideographs for hear. One meant hearing sounds and contained the ideograph for ear. The other was for hearing meanings beneath sounds and combined the ideographs for ear and heart. Nagai was wondering if his own hearing and understanding lacked heart. In his further reading with Pascal, he noted that Pascal said there were two false attitudes to reason. One is overconfidence in reason, which often leads to barren skepticism. And two, the other is resignation to stupidity, coming from laziness or disinterest. Truth is reached by avoiding these two pitfalls. It requires hard work, but you are a deserter if you refuse to take on the search. He accepted the challenge. There's a reflection that Nagai wrote down later on when he wrote several books, and this was after he was dying of radiation poisoning, and his movements were limited. And this is one reflection he wrote about this time in his life. For 5 years, I was deeply troubled by a little voice I heard, waking and sleeping. What is the meaning of our lives? I read the life stories of all kinds of people in my quest for the meaning of time, for the meaning of mine. But the more I read, the more complex the question became. Of course it did. I was studying others' lives rather than my own. My life is not theirs. The life of each one of us is different, and its meaning is unique. He compares one's life to a work of lace, or lace work. He says you probably remember the fine lace that women used to make in their homes before factory machines made women's clothing cheap and uniform. They would make the most complicated-looking piece of lace from one unbroken thread. It all looked very mysterious to me, but to a good lace maker, the pattern and the weaving were quite simple. Our lives are like lace, appearing unbelievably complicated and mixed up to others. It is essential to remember that your life has to make meaning only to you. I did not know that at this time and began feverishly reading philosophers. The more I read them, the more complex the whole question of life's meaning became. Of course, I realize now that some philosophers write for the gallery, for a reading public that is disappointed if things are too plain and simple. The honest seeker is only confused by these less than honest weavers of words. I doggedly tried to follow the demoralizing reasoning of a number of moderns who ended up by saying that life is incomprehensible. Yet the more I thought about it by myself, the more I began to see that birth and life and death can be and should be straightforward. Between the ideographs of the Japanese language, the explanations of them, and his own reflections, that, for me, was just so meaningful. And that is why I think this was a good book. It caused you to really reflect, rather than being, a lighthearted contemporary work of fiction, or simply a narrative history, or even historical fiction, which has its lighthearted moments, and interesting prose to weave in what can be otherwise dreary history into something that's very readable. In this case, we have something that talks about a historical occurrence and how it affected the life of a handful of individuals, in this book. It goes deeper because of the philosophy that's addressed, the language, very fortunately, the language that is so beautiful, the Japanese language. And because it incorporates as well a deeper, more spiritual reflection on life itself and the meaning of suffering, which comes to all of us in life. And what power we can have over that. In other words, how we're going to decide to deal with that suffering. I think this book is just beautiful. Some parts are very moving, but not too gory when they describe, of course, when the bomb fell. But it's not yucky, gory, and oh my gosh, I'm going to have nightmares. At least I didn't. But then again, I work in healthcare. But I think this book is a valuable read for people, because I think all of us have those questions and all of us want to find those answers. And it's simple, yet it's not. But I think as well, this is a wonderful example of how one man decided to face the impossibility of loss, of people who were very close to him, whom he loved very much. He knew he was dying of radiation poisoning, and he had 2 young children who'd already lost their mother. So you can imagine the suffering wasn't just physical, it was this anxiety as well, as how are his children going to be taken care of after he's gone? Will they be all right? All those things a parent would think about if they knew they were leaving. It turned a dark moment in history ultimately into something that was very beautiful in the end. It continues to be to this day. If I ever do go to Japan, now I know that I want to see the memorial to him. There is a statue that you can find in Nagasaki of this doctor, because he's considered a hero in Nagasaki. He really was a source of strength for a lot of people. He didn't write until he was bedridden. And here's a picture of him writing while he's in bed. So he always had to lie on his back to write. Very interesting. And he wrote with a pencil rather than with a pen. It was easier for him, which I find fascinating. And all throughout the book, you find illustrations that he himself made and were in his books. I'm trying to find one. He was influenced by the famous poetry that I mentioned. I hope I mentioned it. The famous Japanese style of poetry. And he would do the same. This is an example of his calligraphy. And there are drawings later on down the line that I'm trying to find. He drew, he made illustrations of his daughter. There's one. I'd like to find more of Takashi Nagai's books. He wrote over 10, I believe, while in bed, all bedridden. They include the poetry that he wrote, the illustrations that he drew, as well as his own reflections. I'd like to know how many of those are published in English. That would be cool to read. Okay, that's it, everyone. Thanks for sitting here and having coffee with me at this ridiculously early hour. Have an awesome week. I will see you in just a few days. Take care, everyone.